My name is Manuel Roig Francia. I'm a reporter at the Washington Post, and I'd like to welcome you all to this very special event. First off, we wanted to thank our co-chairman of the festival, David Rubenstein, and other sponsors of this event, and wanted to point out that if you are also interested in supporting the festival, you can look in your program for information about doing that. Also, we're very fortunate that today Professor Jackson has agreed to take some questions. So if after his presentation you would like to ask him about this very interesting work of his, please come to the microphones and smile pretty, because I'm told that it may be appearing later on videos or on television. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Lawrence P. Jackson, prolific author and professor. He has produced a very comprehensive and interesting biography of an author we should all know about named Chester Hines. Now, Professor Jackson knows a bit about well-known authors in the United States. He also is the author of a biography of Ralph Ellison. And myself, as a person who was born in Spain, I was very interested to learn that Chester Hines spent a good deal of time in Spain, in the city of Alicante. Just one of the many surprises I think that you'll find in this very interesting work. So, with no further ado, I will hand the stage to Professor Jackson, and I think that you will look forward to hearing about this book that has really shined a light on a very interesting figure in American letters. Professor Jackson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I brought my books, the other books that I've written before, because yesterday I realized that no one knew who Chester Hines was, and I was pretty sure they didn't know who Professor Jackson was either. And you have come to the National Book Festival, and unfortunately you're going to get something of an academic lecture. So please bear with me, because I have a number of slides that I think are fascinating. I will go through them very rapidly so that we can have time for a dialogue, and I really look forward to hearing from your questions. So I started work on this project, Biography of Chester Hines, sort of the unknown of the four famous mid-20th century African-American writers, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, and Chester Hines. I started collecting research in 2003, and it's been an amazing journey. So Chester Hines was actually born in Jefferson City, Missouri, and his claim to fame was that he came from what amounted to an upper-middle-class African-American family. You can see Chester in the christening dress with his older brothers, and the two brothers, Chester and Joseph Sandy Hines Jr., they were only separated by about 18 months, so they really grew up in sort of close companionship. And Chester's father was a blacksmithing instructor at Lincoln University. Lincoln, and if you've just come from the Ron Chernow lecture, was founded by members of the United States Colored Troops. So African-American soldiers at the end of the Civil War actually founded a college in Missouri, and it was explicitly designed to cater to the needs of freed people, right? It was going to, as we were talking yesterday, David M. Rubenstein was talking about the crisis of functional illiteracy in the United States, and the connection between illiteracy and social income inequality. And this was actually on the agenda of African-American soldiers at the end of the Civil War. So Joseph Sandy Hines was a blacksmith instructor. He's in the center of this photograph, sort of the small man with the apron in the back. And he designed things for his family. He was sort of the apple of his children's eye. But things were not always easy in their household, and they left Lincoln after sort of the Booker T. Washington machine, I think, decided that maybe he was a little bit too radical, and they went to Mississippi. Now, of course, it was also, they're going there about 1913. So it was also at the time that his expertise in blacksmithing was becoming absolutely outmoded, right? So I say that he went someplace where the 19th century was on more sure footing. So they went to Alcorn, Mississippi. So Chester's mother was a very, very accomplished and extremely well-educated African-American woman named Estelle Bomar Hines. And I know you can't see his dad but so well in the picture, but his father was a dark brown-skinned African-American man, and his mother was a very, very, what we used to use the euphemism, fair-skinned, a very, very light-complexioned African-American woman who sometimes chose to pass for white to avail herself of services, like the dentist in Mississippi, that were unavailable to African Americans. She very strongly chafed against the restrictions of racial segregation. Chester Hines always said that his father more or less accepted the second-class citizenship. Some of us believe that there's only citizenship or not, but nonetheless that he accepted the role of subservience that you had to play for survival, and that his mother absolutely rejected it. And of the two parents, when he was a child, he began to be really drawn toward his mother's point of view. However, it created a great deal of friction inside of their home. And they moved again to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, to another African-American normal school, which is today the branch of the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. And in 1924, Chester Hines' brother was very, very badly injured in a chemistry experiment gone awry. So his brother was only 18 months older, wound up losing his sight. So the family moved to St. Louis to go to the hospital that was available to African Americans for really complicated surgical operations, the Barnes Hospital in St. Louis. And they bought a house not far from Sumner High School where Chester Hines would go to school. But as you can sort of see from this pattern already, he was moving around quite a bit as a young person and becoming a little bit unmoored. The family, the Hines family, had two branches. And one of the branches of the family had moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where there was a great deal of opportunity for African Americans in the early 1910s and 1920s. Roddy and Ella and Leah Moon were his aunt and uncle. Roddy Moon was a paterfamilias kind of a guy. He was one of the founders of the NAACP in Cleveland. He had a federal government job as a meat inspector, and he let everybody know, that he wasn't going to accept second-class citizenship. They also moved beyond the bounds of segregated Cleveland and into sort of an early version of an affluent neighborhood. And after Joseph's sight was completely lost, the family relocated again to Cleveland, to this house at Everton Avenue. And even though, sort of went through the Cleveland slides quite quickly, that by the time you get to sort of the mid-1920s, Cleveland is the 6th largest metropolis in the United States. It was big city. Chester Hines had, sort of grown up in these sort of small country towns, not so far from Vicksburg and Lorman, Mississippi. He'd lived for a little while in Augusta, Georgia. St. Louis was a big city, but still, maybe in a smaller neighborhood. And then to heavily industrialized Cleveland. His family bought a house in a Jewish neighborhood in many of the northeastern and sort of midwestern cities. That's the pattern of migration. African Americans followed Jewish Americans into somewhat suburban neighborhoods often. And Hines graduated from high school, one of a very few black students at an integrated high school in the Jewish neighborhood in Cleveland. It's worthwhile to remember that Langston Hughes also has sort of a similar academic career and is just a few years older than Chester Hines. In the summer of 1926, Chester Hines graduated from high school. He graduated in January, and he's working at this really posh hotel, the Ward Park Manor Hotel. And African Americans had all of the service jobs, the busboys, the porters, the custodial staff. And one day he was flirting with two young white women, and I sort of mention this because it's going to wind up coming up again and again in the work and life of Chester Hines, interracial sexual desire. He was flirting, and he steps backwards towards the elevator doors, and the doors open, but the elevator car had passed to the next floor. And Hines free fell about 20 feet, and he hit the bottom of the elevator shaft. He broke several of his vertebrae. He broke his wrist off in half. He chipped all of his teeth. He broke his jaw. I think he ruptured his spleen. It was incredible that he survived. He was rushed to a hospital, and he was put in a body cast, and he had to convalesce for a period of about 10 weeks. During this period of convalescence on the hospital ward, he's surrounded by people who died. One person from blood poisoning, another person from a heart attack, sudden heart attack, and he also started to receive, very powerful opiates to reduce the pain. Hines then matriculates to Ohio State University. He, again, is about 4 years ahead of someone like Jesse Owens. And Ohio State, the state of Ohio, if you graduated from one of the high schools, you could, sort of make your way into the freshman class. And they did not bar African Americans. What they did was they prevented you from participating in sort of the fullness of college life. You couldn't live in the dormitories. They only had dormitories for men at the time. You couldn't join the social clubs or the eating clubs. Your social existence was completely separate. And it was sort of during this moment that Chester Hines really began a lifelong rebellion, and also an incredible sense of criticism and circumspection about the African-American middle class and black strivers. And there are some sort of really remarkable stories that come about helping us understand the resilience of black social life in the 19-teens and the 1920s, like the founding of the famous black fraternities and sororities. Now, some of us think that the most famous of them were founded in 1911 and have the colors crimson and cream, but there are others. And Chester Hines, was striving to belong to one of the others, Alpha Phi Alpha, which is founded at Cornell. Kappa Alpha Psi was founded at Indiana University. Omega Psi Phi is also founded in 1911 at Howard University. And so he was sort of in this group of black strivers, the son of Oscar DePriest, the first African-American congressman in the 20th century representing Chicago, is one of his classmates. And, he's thinking, hey, I'm gonna be a doctor, But as I said, Chester really started dealing with some rebellion and some rebelliousness. And also, he's still sort of getting like all of this pain medication, and he received a compensatory stipend from the Ohio Industrial Commission. So then he was also like a super wealthy freshman in college. This is at the same moment that Josephine Baker and Ethel Waters are wowing and tantalizing audiences with this new music and these new dances and the strong sexuality of the 1920s also was right there for Chester. This is a great picture. This is the earliest picture where you have sort of a close-up of his face. This is Chester about 17, 18. He was a nice looking young man. He flunked out of school and returns to Cleveland, where his parents have divorced. They've sold the elegant home in the Jewish neighborhood. They're constantly bickering over what the child support payments should be. His father, who had been an esteemed professor, is now a custodian at a nightclub. And on the portion of Cleveland that Chester would know best, you have a series of bars, saloons, gambling dens, and brothels, really very close to where the African-American middle class would have been if you were in the segregated neighborhood. And I want to say sort of like the environment pulled him in. And Chester started frequenting especially a gambling club, and he became good at blackjack, and he became good at craps, and he started to get a reputation. And soon enough, Chester was a part of not a syndicate, but a part of a crew of robbers, and they decided to steal pistols from the YMCA. Now, why they used to store pistols at the YMCA, I can't tell you. But they got some pistols from the YMCA. They drove to Youngstown to sell the pistols. He was arrested, and he goes to trial with short pants on, and the judge says, oh, look at this clean-cut young guy. He never would have done anything, sort of this dastardly or what have you. He was paroled to the care of his parents. His mother and father were fighting about how he should be disciplined. And in the late fall, Thanksgiving of 1928, Chester decided on a lark, after getting a tip about some money and jewels at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Miller, that he would try a daring robbery, and he conducts a home invasion. He waits for them in the garage, he forces his way in, he steals the money and the jewels, and he goes to Chicago, where he was arrested and brought back to Cleveland. And here again, Chester is, he's 19, and he had received a lot of support from his family when he'd had these other sort of, I wouldn't say criminal peccadillos, but where all of the stolen items were returned and they paid restitution, and he promised never to do it again. And Chester went before a judge. One of the rulings that I did notice from Judge McMahon was upholding racial segregation in housing in 1928 in Cleveland. But he goes before Judge McMahon shortly after, it's right around Christmas, 1928, and the judge throws the book at him. And if you look at the ledger of who came before Judge McMahon, sort of on that day, Chester gets basically as much time behind bars as everybody else combined. So before he was 20, before he had graduated from college, he never returned to college, he was an inmate at the Ohio State Penitentiary. Prison in the 1920s is somewhat similar, more or less similar to prison today, with perhaps two exceptions. It was designed to break the will of incorrigible men. And one of the things that the guards did to do that was that they used fairly vigorous corporal punishment. That would have been a steady part of one's experience of incarceration. And, it was very regimented, very harsh. And also, African Americans were expected to work in the coal company. They basically crushed coal and fed coal to the boilers. It was outside work, and it was considered the lowest and most degrading of the jobs that one had in prison. Because of his injuries, Chester did not work in this company. He was in a company that they called the Crippled Company, and they had somewhat preferential treatment. So, but in 1929 and 1930, this wasn't really the thing that consumed him. What happened was, on April the 21st, 1930, the largest fire in American prison history broke out at the Ohio State Penitentiary, taking the lives of more than 320 men, many of whom were burned alive. Many, probably the majority, suffocated from smoke inhalation. And it was a classic case of really an avertible tragedy, and also a very painful kind of a travesty, if you will. What happened was, once the fire broke out and the guards understood what was going on, they started to let some of the prisoners out, and they began at the bottom tiers and worked their way up. And as you can imagine, by the time it's a 6-tier cell block. And by the time they got up to the third floor, the heat was unbearable. And so everybody perished, if you were on the 5th and the 6th blocks. And the prison guards, or rather the prison superintendent's point of view was he was standing on the outside of the gates with a machine gun trained at the entrance. And so it's sort of this experience of seeing such catastrophic loss of life that Chester Hines really began to turn inward and to think of himself in a literary way. Almost immediately, he begins producing incredible short stories. By 1934, Esquire Magazine is founded either right at the end of 1932 or in the beginning of 1933. By 1934, African-American Chester Hines is publishing short fiction in Esquire Magazine alongside Ernest Hemingway, John Dos Passos. They are, sort of bringing out, Leon Trotsky has something in Esquire. Langston Hughes is the other African-American writer. Esquire is definitely sort of a transformative publication for American literary sensibilities, and it really begins to sort of present the American male not necessarily as the breadwinner and father figure, but sort of more as the sort of like a hip James Bond kind of a figure. Looking for a metaphor. Hines becomes one of their most highly regarded artists, and he publishes during this time in venues like Esquire what we call white life stories. So there are only secondary African-American characters. The protagonists of the short stories, Red, Into What Red Hell, are white American men, and they're all, sort of enraged. And you're sort of dealing with their inner world and the struggles that they have about confinement and, sort of longing and desire, sexual desire, but especially, again, this rage at being in prison. And Chester then starts to think about what his career would be like as a novelist, somebody who sort of writes his way out of incarceration. He has a couple of really strong advantages. One of them was his cousin, Henry Lee Moon. This is the son of Roddy and Leah, so it's his first cousin. Henry Lee Moon winds up being the press secretary for Robert Weaver, who is the first African-American, sort of like the housing secretary in the Roosevelt administration. Weaver is the highest-ranking black cabinet person in the 1930s. You all have heard of what they call the kitchen cabinet, led by Mary McLeod Bethune. That includes people like Weaver, and would also, sort of gesture to other African Americans who would have been sort of leaders in either the union movement, like A. Philip Randolph, or people like Walter White, the secretary of the NAACP, and then his deputy, Roy Wilkins, and then the Sterling attorney, Thurgood Marshall. But Henry Lee Moon knows all of these people, right? They're all actually intimates of his. And he's this important journalist. He's the first person to break the story in the New York Times and really in the national press about the shift in electoral voting patterns that will enable African Americans who've moved to major northern metropolises to be able to shift the balance of power, right? If the African Americans get behind a Democratic candidate, then those candidates will win because the balance of power has shifted with this new black migration. And sort of Henry Lee Moon brings that out in a series of articles in the New York Times. And he really inspires Chester, who wants to sort of, stay even with his brother, who earns a PhD, and then also his cousin, who's sort of a big shot in New York. And Hines starts thinking, once I can get out of prison, I can sort of make it. What happens also with the fire is that the Ohio State Parole Board begins to take its work seriously, and they start to parole men. So all of a sudden, he has this 20-year sentence hanging over him, and it gets reduced to a 7-year sentence. So Chester comes out in 1936. He goes back to Cleveland, where he's, trying to make it as a writer and sort of hitting his head against the wall, as all writers do, right? As all writers must. In the company of a really progressive white couple who have founded a playwright house for African-American artists, the Jelliffs, they introduced him to one of the most popular writers in the United States, Louis Bromfield, who has this sort of remarkable place in Ohio called Malabar Farm. Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart get married at Malabar Farm in 1945, right? So Bromfield is, highly regarded. He's rich. He seems to know what he's talking about. He says, hey, Chester, you and your wife, Jeanne, you all come out to Malabar for the summer. I will introduce you to the people in Hollywood. I'll take your manuscript to New York to my publishing friends, and, I will sort of make your career. One of the things that's fascinating is that one of his great friends, Louis Bromfield's great friends, was Edna Ferber, the author of Showboat, that sort of brought Paul Robeson really to the fore of American culture when he sings Old Man River. And Edna Ferber had a hand in the career of the African-American novelist Waters Turpin, who publishes several novels at the end of the 1930s. Waters Turpin's mother had worked for Edna Ferber, and Turpin himself had sort of served during the summers when he was in college as, sort of a help around the house or at parties, that sort of thing. My mother is here with us today, and she had Waters Turpin at Morgan State University as one of her English professors, right? So I think that Bromfield wanted to do Edna Ferber one better, and he said, I'm going to take this African-American ex-con, and I'm going to make him, big, major literary celebrity. And so Chester took him at his word, and he goes to California. That's what Bromfield said. He said, you need to go out to Los Angeles, where they're making all these prison movies in the summer of 1940, 1941. And so Hines moves out there, and he gets the door shut in his face every place that he goes. People love Esquire. They know him from Esquire. They think that this is sort of tremendous work, but they say, hey, man, you're way too black to be in these places, okay? And so Chester becomes quite bitter about, his rejection. And it's more than that. In fact, he learns that the racial integration practices with the war services industries in California, where especially you have, you've got shipyards, and then you also have these Air Force industries, and these places are as segregated as if you're in Louisiana or Texas or Alabama. And he says the only thing that's different is the attitude. He says that whites in California expect you to be grateful. And he was absolutely disgusted. He, at this time, becomes more and more closely connected and enamored of the very far left, but especially the Communist Party. In a book I wrote called Indignant Generation, I say that we should really think about sort of three institutions that have given us the indignant generation, the generation of black writers who really changed national attitudes towards issues of race and also some issues of what I think could be called American imperialism. But the Communist Party, the Julius Rosenwald Fund, and the Federal Writers Project would be the three. The Communist Party, very significant as the first interracial organization, genuinely interracial organization that cultivates African-American writers. And so Hines gets to know this sort of side of the world more intimately in Los Angeles. He had worked as a Federal Writers Project writer in Cleveland in the end of the 1930s, at the end of the 1930s. And, all of these ironies, he and Jeanne get this house. I'm sorry, I should go back because I didn't just want to say, so that's his wife, Jeanne Hines. They meet when she's 16 and he's 19. And Chester Hines, the taller two, and then the shorter couple are the leaders of the Communist Party. This is not in the book. I only learned this actually after the publication of the book. Somebody identified the photograph, but that's the two couples. But the nicest house that they ever lived in was one that became available to them. Why? Because of the Relocation Act that removed Japanese citizens from Los Angeles, right? And this is topped off by 1943 and what sometimes we call them the Zoot riots. 1943 is is as incendiary a year as 1968. But we don't remember it that way, which is interesting. In Los Angeles, you had groups of servicemen combing neighborhoods, beating Latinos and blacks who were wearing the latest fashion of the day, the Zoot suit. And Chester said he sat at this house with a rifle on his knee, and he did that in preparation of white mobs coming to drag him and Jeanne out. You see a dramatic shift in his writing in 1943, 1944. He published in the NAACP and in the Urban League's journals, what I would call fairly conservative publications. Geared towards the black middle class, geared towards the white philanthropic interests. And he started to publish these really biting, trenchant pieces that advocated direct assault, revolutionary practice against the regime of segregation. During a wartime, remember, this is sedition. So Negro Martyrs are needed. The time for revolution is now. And again, they're coming out in these mainstream publications. As you know, this didn't sit well with the powers that be. And so he started to be a target of the FBI right at this point. Chester Hines was undaunted. These kinds of being surveilled or rejection, sometimes even more direct kinds of persecutions, never fazed him. And he wrote what many people consider his most daring and outrageous work, If He Hollers, Let Him Go, right at this moment, 1944, 1945. And if you think of Native Son by Richard Wright, this book that sells 500,000 copies in 1940, as having an undercurrent of sexual tension between Bigger and Mary Dalton. Remember, Mary Dalton is accidentally suffocated as Bigger is carrying her, or he's carried her into her bedroom. Her sightless mother, appears in the doorway. This novel, If He Hollers, Let Him Go, is about the overcurrent of interracial sexual desire. And in fact, it's a very dramatic story in the book where I talk about what is done to this book when it is going through the process of publication. Chester does meet Richard Wright. He moves to New York, or sort of relocates to New York. He and Wright become friends. Chester also, unlike other writers who are sort of playing the game with publishers and reviewers, he was combative. If you sort of came out and you said, hey, If He Hollers, Let Him Go is not sophisticated literary technique, but especially people who disagreed with his politics, he had words for you, and he often put them in print in mainstream publications. And he could sort of show himself well for photographers when he wanted to, but he was also widely known as a person who was very fond of a taste of whiskey. He became friends with Carl Van Vechten, a literary tastemaker. Van Vechten, sort of gave us this really remarkable photograph from 1946 that's on the cover of the book. Van Vechten was probably the white man that Hines was closest to. They remained friends throughout the rest of Van Vechten's life. He died in 1964. And Chester always needed not just sort of emotional or spiritual support, but he often, like most writers, needed financial support. And Van Vechten was very good that way. Chester also got to know Ralph Ellison and Fannie Ellison. In fact, this is Chester's shot of Ralph and Fannie, where they're sharing Thanksgiving 1946 together. No, 1947 together. They were very close friends. 1946, excuse me, I'm looking at the thing. Don't look at your own slides. So the novel that I think he should be best known for is called Lonely Crusade. Lonely Crusade never comes out in paperback in an American edition. So that's part of the reason why we sort of don't really know it. The books that are available now are ones that are they're UK editions. Chester, around this time, really began the most snarled and complex and combative, antagonistic, hostile relationship with publishers of any writer I'm familiar with, but certainly among African-American writers. And he wanted this book to be, sort of the great prize winner and bestseller, but unfortunately it flopped. And this was in some ways, this is the book I think that we still need to digest. I mean, this is the book about the difficulty of black labor and the creation of a bona fide black middle class. And, basically this is a suggestion that we have, great distance to travel. When his friend Ralph Ellison read it, he said, "Oh, Chester, you've betrayed me intellectually." And they fell apart as friends. Ellison was becoming known at the end of the 1940s as really the not just the great black intellectual, but somebody who understood themselves to be sort of the great artist, and it's sort of like Langston Hughes and Chester Hines. They're like peasants in some ways, sort of a lofty picture of Ralph Ellison. And Ellison would often say to admirers, that he thought that Chester was intellectually dishonest. And it was sort of interesting. Chester featured a, sort of a kind of an ad hominem attack on Ellison in the novel Lonely Crusade. It's hilarious. You really must read it. Chester also was friends with the guy in the center is Horace Katyn, one of our sort of underknown African-American reviewers, intellectuals, writer in his own right from Chicago. But despite the support of really a group of people, Chester still could not sort of make it in the United States. And so in 1953, he left the United States, really never to return, with the exception of, sort of 10 months, 11 months it's really coming down, in 1955. But he would take the United States as a tourist. And so he had this sort of, pretty good early success when he went abroad. He had some of his novels translated, like Lonely Crusade, which was called La Croisade de l'Igodin. And then he also was able to finish writing another work of his, which is incredibly important, called The Third Generation. And that was completed while he was sort of traveling Europe, living in Spain, living in the United Kingdom, living in France. It's sort of funny that when they advertised this book, even though Chester and Ralph Ellison had some people say it's a knife fight. They had a knife fight on New Year's Day, 1953, just before Chester leaves. And they still had to go to Ralph Ellison for a quote when they advertised the book in the New York Times. On his way overseas, Chester met this woman, Willa Thompson, who was sort of from an American blue blood, blue vein, social register kind of a background. She was a Smith College graduate. She had relatives who were ambassadors. She lived in Belgium and had a family in Belgium, and she had distinguished herself also during the Second World War. And they had this sort of torrid love affair where, they wanted to get married and be an interracial married couple, but the burden really was quite extraordinary in the early 1950s, even for people living abroad, certainly for people trying to make a living as a writing couple. I think that one of the reasons why Chester didn't publish a book in 1955 was that he spent so much time writing letters to Willa Thompson, and she certainly sent him about 100 of these, 4 or 5 page single-space documents, where they sort of exhaustively go through every dimension of their relationship. And what was fascinating was that Chester was often accused of using people, and it's not clear to me how he would have been able to use her. I mean, I think in some ways she got the better of the relationship. But in 1967, he was asked by the New York Times Book Review to talk about his work of fiction that he enjoyed the most. And he used that as an opportunity to really expose some of the intimacies of their relationship. Overseas, we have the reconstruction of really an important, very, very significant milieu of writers and intellectuals. Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Chester Hines, Oliver Harrington, William Gardner Smith. And that's a shot of Wright and Harrington at the cafe. James Baldwin is there. There's William Gardner Smith, who was from Philadelphia. Smith is, again, far-left African-American novelist, political figure in Philadelphia as a youth organizer against segregation, and then, sort of goes overseas. And then also, more recently, sort of the man of the hour, Richard Gibson, another really a literary protege person who wins fellowships and prizes at 19 and 20 and then goes overseas. When the Trump administration released the JFK files, the last batch, 19,000 documents, were released in January or at the end of December. It was revealed that Richard Gibson actually was a Central Intelligence Agency agent. And this had been something that he had been accused of, mainly by Chester Hines, as early as 1957. And the documents that we have from the agency files, I don't know that it's necessarily the total release of Gibson materials. I requested these materials in 2004 and was told, that there was really nothing to find. But that Gibson began certainly a formal and official relationship as a clandestine agent in 1965. So as I said, Chester was the overseas person, and so I'll get to the punchline. The final shift in his career, we would have called him sort of a naturalist writer, a social realist writer in the language of James Baldwin. But in 1956, living overseas, even though he just published a novel called The Primitive, which is about a weekend interracial love affair that ends in violence and murder, but he had sort of fallen in like with a young German actress, Regina Fisher, and they lived together in Paris in the poor quarter. I mean, he always talked about eating dog meat because that's what to be thrown out, and they were surviving on that. And she fell madly in love with him. She esteemed him. This is also at the time of the famous Black Writers Conference in Paris in 1956. And she attempted suicide several times that fall and was eventually sent to her parents in Germany. And it's right at that moment that French publisher, editor at the Gallimard Publishing Company, Marcel Duhamel, approaches Chester Hines again for the second time in about 2 years about writing a detective fiction. And Hines thought that it was really low work beneath him, but he was starving, and so he agreed to do it. And Regina Fisher, she backed him up, and she would say, you can turn it into great literature and, sort of go ahead and, give it a try. And the result was a novel called For Love of Immabel, or A Rage in Harlem, turned into a film in the late 1980s, starring Forrest Whitaker, Gregory Hines, and Robin Givens. And the plot was given Chester by my Baltimore homeboy, Walter Coleman, who is an artist. And Walter said that the plot is about the scam where you say you're going to turn $500 into $25,000, and it's called The Blow. And Chester developed this plot into a really absurdist novel, giving you the crisis of Black urban life at the same time that you can see the hopelessness of liberal American political solutions to that sort of crisis. And this is what took Chester forward to a new generation and made him so influential in the 1960s. Because unlike many of his peers, maybe especially Ralph Ellison, who had sometimes a very difficult relationship with the writers of the 1960s and early 1970s, Chester was beloved by these writers. I just want to get to show you a couple of slides. For one thing, Chester Hines was thought well of and was sort of connected to Malcolm X because he continued to write political journalism even though living abroad, and he would always make these really, really cutting remarks about the capacity of the United States to overcome its history of slavery and racial segregation. And you can see Chester really taking, in some ways, in France at the time, remember that Charles de Gaulle was the victim of an assassination attempt in, I think it's 1962, and Chester is sort of calling out the French far right and is also comparing them to the state of Mississippi. And he was always, sort of very outspoken, very vigorous. And when Malcolm X visits 1964, November 1964, interestingly enough, right, he goes to see Chester Hines. Chester Hines had become, he said when this magazine cover was published in France, he said everybody thought that it was Nasser, and he had sort of become like this elder statesman of the Pan-African, Pan-Arab world. Pan-African world, I mean, Nasser as the Prime Minister of Egypt. But that this was sort of a kind of a literary, cultural, and political statesmanship that had these sort of transnational boundaries. And I'll leave you with one final image. I really love this photograph. This is, Chester Hines died in 1984. He was bedridden pretty much the last year of his life. And because of the fall from about 1973 onwards, I mean, it was very difficult for him to get around. And he went into a wheelchair, I think sporadically at the end of the 70s, and then more or less permanent confinement for the 1980s. But this photograph gives you a sense of the indomitable will of this black man from Cleveland, from Jefferson City, from Lorman, from Augusta, from the penitentiary, and then also who scaled the absolute heights of American literary stardom, as well as international literary stardom. He always said that people always talk a lot about James Baldwin. They think James Baldwin is so great. He said, but I'm better known in France than James Baldwin is. Thank you very much. We have time for some questions.
I had a question. What happened to his wife, Jeanne?
Thank you. So Chester met Jeanne, as I said, it's sort of right after he leaves school, and they meet at a kind of a wild party. The wild parties were always in the alleyway, and he said he first started carrying a pistol because he had to protect the two of them, but especially men that wanted to, sort of take advantage of her and turn her out onto the street as a prostitute. She married while he was in prison. She married one of the people who was in his burglary gang, burglar who was a fellow burglar, right, and part of the gang. And they got divorced shortly after Chester Hines was released. And then he and Jeanne really began what seems like a genuine partnership, I mean, well beyond romance, that lasted until he left the United States through the 1940s. But what was fascinating about the relationship, and that was a source of deep bitterness and strong insecurity for Chester Hines, was that arguably because of his prison record, but he believed that it actually had to do with the preference of American institutions, but especially American liberals, maybe just American liberals, the strong preference that they had for black women over black men. She had a flourishing career in what was originally, first she worked for sort of nascent social welfare agencies, the USO during the Second World War, recreation and social services at women's confinement facilities. And he always, again, was quite bitter and insecure about the success that she had, more or less in the white-collar, white world, that he felt like he was consistently denied, and it had something to do with, again, this bitter wrangling that he always had with publishers. And they also had a tremendously tempestuous relationship. Both were heavy drinkers and did and said things under the influence of alcohol that they then later regretted. And they, sort of went back and forth from 1948 for the 5 years until basically the relationship collapsed in 1952. And then they were formally divorced in 1976, and he remarried Leslie Packard. I showed a slide of her, who became the caretaker of his literary estate. Thank you for the question.
If I understood correctly, if I understood you correctly, the rest of his life he spent in Paris. Was he buried there? Did he ever go back to the United States? And would he have had more impact if he would have come back to America?
To begin at the end, yeah, I have to, or I would hope that he would have had more impact in the United States if he lived here, you know, for the rest of his career. He was the kind of person temperamentally who found really any residue or vestige of the condescending attitudes of racism and the practices of racial segregation absolutely unbearable. So he felt like he needed to leave the United States not to be able to endure that. So in '53, he goes to Paris really just for vacation. He lived in London for about 6 months. Then they moved to Spain for, you know, a couple of months. Then he came back to Paris. He goes to the US for more or less all of 1955, then back to Paris for about 3 years, moving around Europe quite a bit. And then he settles in Spain in 1969. That's when the house that he started building in 1967 was complete, and then he completely relocated to Spain. He spent considerable amounts of time in places like Amsterdam, wherever he sort of met friends and people who were conducive to, you know, sort of the things that he was interested in. Oh, yeah, and he's buried in Spain. He's buried in Marrera in Spain. Thank you so much.